Do you know that between 1500 and 1900, approximately 12.5 million people were forced onto slave ships? Do you know that nearly 1.8 million of them, almost 1 in 7, never survived the crossing? Do you know that in 1781, the captain of a ship called the Zong ordered 132 sick and dying Africans thrown overboard alive? Not because he was unusually cruel, but because maritime insurance law made it profitable. And do you know that when the case went to a British court, it was heard not as a murder trial, but as an insurance dispute over lost cargo? This is the Middle Passage. And before we talk about numbers, we need to understand what it actually felt like to be inside one of those ships. The temperature below deck regularly reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit, even at midnight. Olaudah Equiano, who survived this crossing in 1756, described the air as entirely unfit for respiration. He wrote, "The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate almost suffocated us. This produced copious perspirations, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration, from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died. This was not a prison, nor was it a dungeon. This was the cargo hold of a wooden sailing ship pitching violently across the open Atlantic Ocean. Hundreds of human beings were chained together in total darkness. They were forced to lie on bare wooden planks, their bodies rubbing raw against the grain with every wave. They were bound in pairs, right wrist to left wrist, right ankle to left ankle. For up to 13 weeks, they lived, slept, bled, and died in this position. This was the Middle Passage. It was the largest forced migration in the history of the world, and for nearly 2 million people, it was a graveyard. The scale of the transatlantic slave trade is difficult to comprehend. The Slave Voyages database, compiled by historians over decades, documents more than 36,000 individual slave ship voyages. Between the early 1500s and the late 1800s, approximately 12.5 million Africans were forced aboard these vessels. Only 10.7 million survived to disembark in the Americas. That means roughly 1.8 million people perished at sea. 14.4% of all those who boarded never saw land again. On an average voyage, the mortality rate hovered between 12 and 15%. But on catastrophic crossings, where disease or starvation took hold, death rates could exceed 50%. The crossing itself took 6 to 8 weeks on a typical voyage. However, if a ship encountered doldrums, windless stretches of ocean, the journey could stretch to 13 agonizing weeks. Every additional day at sea meant depleted water rations and multiplying pathogens. Time was the enemy of survival. These vessels were not passenger ships, they were floating warehouses designed for maximum profit. In 1787, British abolitionists published the floor plan of a Liverpool slave ship called the Brooks. It became one of the most effective pieces of visual evidence in the history of the abolitionist movement. The diagram showed precisely how 454 enslaved people were packed into the hull. But records show the Brooks was legally permitted to carry even more. The design allocated a space of just 6 feet by 1 foot 4 inches for an adult man. Women were given 5 feet 10 inches by 1 foot 4 inches. Children were allocated 5 feet by 1 foot 2 inches. The standard headroom between decks was roughly 18 to 24 inches. It was impossible for an adult to sit up straight, let alone stand. They remained horizontal, side by side, stacked like lumber in the stifling dark. Slave ship captains engaged in ruthless financial calculations before every voyage. This led to a grim debate within the trade between tight packing and loose packing. Tight packers believed in cramming as many bodies into the hull as physically possible. They accepted that a higher percentage of their human cargo would die on the journey. But they calculated that the sheer volume of survivors would yield a higher net profit at auction. Loose packers took a different approach, preferring to carry slightly fewer enslaved people. Their logic was that better ventilation and slightly more space would reduce mortality. They believed a healthier, surviving cargo would command higher prices in the Americas. Both philosophies viewed human beings purely as commodities subject to margins of loss. Whether tight or loose, The conditions were uniformly barbaric. Men were systematically shackled below deck to prevent uprisings. Women and children were sometimes left unchained, though this exposed them to unchecked sexual violence from the crew. The horror began before the ship even lost sight of the African coast. The transition from the open air of their homes to the suffocating dark of the hold induced immediate trauma. The smell below deck was universally described in historical accounts as overwhelming. It was an unventilated mixture of human waste, vomit, rotting food, and death. Buckets, known as tubs, were placed at intervals for human waste. But enslaved people, shackled in pairs, often could not reach them in time. As Equiano noted, the filth rapidly became a breeding ground for infectious disease. To keep the cargo alive, captains mandated exercise. Small groups were brought onto the upper deck and forced to dance or jump. This was not recreation, it was a brutal method to prevent muscle atrophy and preserve market value. Those who refused to dance due to illness or despair were beaten with the cat-o'-nine tails. The holds of slave ships were incubators for devastating epidemics. The most common killer was dysentery, referred to then as the bloody flux. Spread rapidly through contaminated water and horrific sanitation, it caused agonizing abdominal pain and fatal dehydration. Smallpox was another terror of the Middle Passage. If the virus boarded the ship, it could annihilate the cargo. Quarantine in the hold was physically impossible. Ophthalmia, a severe eye infection, routinely swept through the decks. It caused temporary and sometimes permanent blindness among both the enslaved and the crew. But there was another fatal condition, documented by ship surgeons as fixed melancholy. Enslaved people would simply stop speaking, stop moving, and refuse all food and water, dying of what modern medicine would recognize as severe clinical depression and trauma. They willed themselves to death rather than endure another day in the dark. No single event exposed the legal framework of slavery more brutally than the massacre aboard the Zong. In September 1781, the Zong departed Africa for Jamaica, grossly overcrowded. Navigational errors by the crew severely prolonged the voyage. Weeks behind schedule, the ship's drinking water began to run dangerously low. Disease had already begun to ravage the enslaved population in the hold. Captain Luke Collingwood made a cold, calculated decision. Under maritime insurance law, if enslaved people died a natural death from disease, the financial loss fell on the ship's owners. But if they were jettisoned, thrown overboard to save the ship and the rest of the cargo, the loss could be claimed on insurance. Over 3 terrifying days, Collingwood ordered his crew to throw 132 sick and dying Africans into the ocean. They were thrown overboard alive. The owners of the Zong filed an insurance claim for the murdered individuals. The insurers refused to pay, and the case went to court in London. It was heard not as a mass murder trial, but purely as an insurance dispute over lost property. If this history matters to you, please take 5 seconds to like this video and subscribe to Unshackled History. Leave a comment below letting us know your thoughts and share this story with others. Despite the chains and the overwhelming force of the crew, resistance was constant. The enslaved fought back with whatever means they had. Some chose to end their own lives by throwing themselves overboard. They believed that in death, their spirits would return to their homeland. Hunger strikes were incredibly common. In response, slavers developed a horrific metal tool called a speculum auris. It was a mechanical device forced into the mouth and cranked open to physically compel feeding. Beyond passive resistance, there were organized, violent uprisings. Historians have documented 493 slave ship revolts between 1509 and 1865. The enslaved vastly outnumbered the crew, and when the opportunity arose, they fought for control of the ships. Most revolts failed, resulting in brutal executions of the leaders. But the constant threat of mutiny terrified European crews and shaped every aspect of ship security. One of the most famous successful revolts occurred aboard the Amistad in 1839. 53 enslaved Africans, led by a man named Sangbe Pierre, managed to free themselves from their irons. Armed with cane knives found in the cargo hold, they overpowered the crew and took control of the vessel. They demanded the surviving navigators sail them back to Africa. Instead, the crew secretly steered north at night, and the ship was eventually intercepted off the coast of New York. The Africans were imprisoned, and a fierce legal battle ensued over their status. The case ultimately reached the United States Supreme Court. Former President John Quincy Adams argued powerfully on their behalf. In a landmark decision, the court ruled that the Africans had been illegally kidnapped and had the right to use violence to free themselves. The survivors of the Amistad finally returned to Africa as free people. For the millions who survived the Middle Passage, arrival in the Americas brought no relief. As slave ships approached ports in the Caribbean or Brazil, preparations for auction began. Enslaved people were brought on deck, washed with seawater, and their skin was rubbed with palm oil. This was done to give them a false appearance of health and vitality to deceive buyers. Graying hair was shaved, and temporary clothing was sometimes provided. After being sold, the survivors entered a brutal period known as seasoning. This was the first 3 years of forced labor on plantations, a period of violent acclimatization to tropical diseases and grueling work. The physical toll of the Middle Passage left them severely weakened. Historians estimate that up to 1/3 of all enslaved people died during this seasoning period. The mortality across capture, the Atlantic crossing, and the first years of labor constituted a staggering loss of human life. The horrors of the Middle Passage eventually became the central focus of the abolitionist movement. Abolitionists understood that abstract moral arguments were not enough. They needed irrefutable, visceral evidence to shock the public conscience. Thomas Clarkson, a leading British abolitionist, tirelessly collected physical evidence from slave ships. He gathered shackles, thumbscrews, and the speculum auris used for force-feeding. He interviewed sailors and surgeons, documenting their first-hand accounts of the atrocities below deck. The publication of the Brooks Diagram and Equiano's best-selling autobiography brought the reality of the holds into European parlors. When abolitionist Granville Sharp tried and failed to bring murder charges for the Zong Massacre, it sparked public outrage. The fact that British law treated the drowning of 132 people purely as an insurance claim laid bare the moral bankruptcy of the trade. It was this relentless exposure of the Middle Passage that finally turned public opinion against the transatlantic slave trade. The history of slavery is a vast, global human tragedy, and most of it has never been properly told. If this video opened your eyes, please like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Click the next video on your screen to keep uncovering the history that was hidden from you.